Good evening and a warm welcome to all of you to this evening's Global Challenge lecture entitled Race Inequality and the University, British and American Perspectives. My name is Masih Noor. I'm a social psychologist here at Keele University. Tonight's lecture is hosted by the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and also it's part of Keele's Race Equality lecture series. For those of you who may be new to the events, ILAS promotes interdisciplinary education and research, both at Keele and beyond. More information is available on the ILAS website, where you can see videos of previous Global Challenge lectures. I'm honored to chair tonight's session and will shortly introduce our esteemed guest speakers. But before doing so, I want to acknowledge and grieve the brutal killings and suffering of our fellow human beings that have taken place right in front of our eyes recently. As a symbol of our profound interconnectedness with and sharing the pain of the helpless victims and their traumatized survivors, I invite you to join me for a minute of silence. Thank you. Let me now introduce you to our esteemed guest speakers. NiCole Buchanan is a professor of psychology at Michigan State University. Her research examines the interplay of race, gender, victimization, and barriers to equity and inclusion in academia, such as the biases that result in the epistemic exclusion of marginalized scholars and their scholarship. Keon West is a professor of social psychology at Goldsmiths, University of London. He's a director of Equalab and a past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. He is especially well known for his research on prejudice, sexual orientation, and sexual health. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome and for that introduction. Keon, I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Yes, so there's always one, isn't there? Someone who doesn't realize that they're still muted, and this time it was me. So hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the very warm welcome. Can I just confirm that everyone can see the slides? So maybe thumbs up, use the team's reaction and thumbs up. Okay, good. NiCole can see the slides. That's fantastic. So good. So you can all see the slides. So thank you very much for having us, and thank you for the very warm welcome and for the very kind introductions. I think what would be best for us would be if we jump right into the presentation and start explaining some of our research and some of where we're going, so that you can understand what we're going to say. We are told that it is typical that there's time at the end for questions. So we're going to follow suit and talk to you for about 45 minutes, sharing the presentation between us. And at the end, you can feel free to ask us any questions we'd like. We'd really be interested to hear what you have to say. If you'd like to contact us, both of our email addresses. So you should be able to see our email addresses and our Twitter profiles up on the screen. I've included both because I currently have, I think, 400 unread emails in my inbox. So that, and NiCole is nodding. This is a problem that is throughout academia, that no one could possibly answer all the emails we get. So you can send us an email, but that's playing dice. You know, it's good luck. Good luck for you. It's actually much faster if you do it by Twitter for me, because I'm much more likely to see it. I only have about 2 unread Twitter messages. Is that the same for you, NiCole? I don't know. Maybe you're more popular than I am on Twitter. You're a bit more popular. But if you do it either one of those ways, we can hope for the best, and you should be able to get through to us, but we would like to hear from you. Okay, so we'll talk about race inequality in the university from the British and American perspectives. I'm British and NiCole is American, and this is where we get our perspectives from. In terms of the content of the presentation, there's just 3 really big questions that we want to answer. And the first one is there still a problem with racism in higher education? And if there is, well, how do we know that? So this seems like a question we should be able to answer. Can we answer it? Can we give a definitive answer to that? The second question is, what are some of the threats to higher education right now? So it's looking at, you know, what are the ways in which this racism is impacting higher education, and what should we be worried about now that we know this, or if we can figure out that this is in the system? And then the third one is, why is this conversation necessary? So given the stuff that we know, why is it that we still have to talk about race and racism in the university? And at the end, you'll hopefully have answers to all 3 of those. But like I said, I do welcome any other questions that you might have on those topics. So I'm going to hand over to NiCole, and she will begin with answering the very first question. Is there still a problem with racism in higher education?
Thank you. And it's funny, as I think about this, to me, the question seems really obvious that we clearly have a problem. If we even just look at who's at the table when we are at our faculty meetings, who are the professors, who are our instructors, it becomes really obvious that we have a real lack of diversity. I know at the university, or in the United States context, if we were to look at Black faculty, we see that Black faculty are grossly underrepresented. And when we look at intersecting identities, for example, Black women, we see that they represent, I think the statistics are 0.3% of all full professors are Black women, so clearly underrepresented, and recently looked at some of the data in the UK and also saw that Black faculty are severely underrepresented, and that's not random, that's not accidental. So when we think about what are the consequences of the lack of diversity, one of the areas I study is what happens with scholarship that's produced. And the lack of diversity that we have in academia then has a variety of negative consequences. We see that in general, people have very little exposure to the kind of research and scholarship that diverse populations are interested in, or research that's on these diverse populations. This lack of exposure then means that people aren't able to have competent conversations around the research, or often related to issues of diversity and social justice or diversity related science. What I tend to find is when people are unable to have thoughtful conversation about these kinds of topics, then they become really resistant to having those conversations. And that kind of challenge can create some cognitive dissonance. So then they will disparage the topics and the scholars doing that work because of the discomfort they have in having to have those conversations. And what we see is that individuals experience that in academia, that resistance that they have creates a lot of hostility for scholars of color, especially if they're doing diversity-related social justice research. And this environment becomes marginalizing for them, devaluing their work, devaluing their contribution. And as a result, we see that there's often consequences of people perhaps even considering leaving fields. This absence of mid-career and senior faculty of color, at least in the US context, although I'm willing to bet that the same is true in the UK, the relative lack of diversity-related research and training then alienates students at all levels. We see undergraduate and graduate students of color are often self-selecting out of fields where they are not represented among the faculty, and they will then move into disciplines that maybe have more faculty that are similar to them, and where there's research that's reflecting them and their interests. So at a minimum, if we think about how do we create a better academia, we have to think about how are we going to recruit and retain diverse students, diverse faculty, how are we going to create fields that embrace their presence, the research that they're interested in, and their scholarship. And if we continue this really slow change for these faculty, where we see very modest changes in women faculty and faculty of color, we're going to have a very limited success in diversifying academia. As a result of this, we're going to see high turnover. We're going to continue to have a hard time retaining and recruiting initially and retaining diverse faculty. And they're going to continue to have these negative experiences of having a sense of not belonging in their institutions, being ostracized, experiencing incivility, marginalization, isolation, and tokenism. You're muted again.
I keep muting myself out of politeness and then forgetting. So all of these negative things are well documented, and you're right. I don't remember the exact statistics, but in the UK, we do have a similar aggressive lack of faculty of color. So I don't remember the exact statistics, but the last time I looked, it was something like less than 1% of the professors in the UK are black, and it doesn't appear to be a number that's going up with any regularity. But there is always a question of, well, maybe this isn't a problem of racism in higher education. Maybe this is a problem of just the ethnic minorities just not being as good. Maybe they're just not as bright. Maybe they just don't work as hard. Maybe they just don't pull their weight. Maybe they're just not doing the same thing. And to answer questions like that, we have studies like these, and I hope you're all familiar with it. So I apologize for explaining something that you all probably understand reasonably well. But nonetheless, I think it's worth going through the details of why studies like these matter. And this is a standard CV study. It's very much a kind of study that you can find hundreds of places in academia. And there are many, many versions of this. And to do a study like this, you simply take a CV and you make a few hundred identical copies of the CV so that everybody has exactly the same CV. Everyone has the same education, the same qualification, the same experience, the same everything, the same history, the same whatever. And all you do is change the one thing on the CV that you're interested in. And in this case, that would be the demographics of the person whose CV you're ostensibly handing out. And in this case, it's actually more complex than this, but at the moment, I'm just going to show you the white man CV, the black man CV, the white woman CV, and the black woman CV. Now, all these CVs, I remind you, are exactly the same. So there are no differences. The white man, the black woman, the black woman, they have exactly the same qualifications and history. It's just the name that's different. And then we send these out to different departments, academic departments in high-ranking research-active universities, and we ask people in these departments to tell us how competent and hireable these people look, across these different CVs. Now, because they're actually the same CV, in theory, they should all be equally competent and equally hireable. That is what we should find if racism wasn't a problem in higher education. But of course, that isn't what we do find. So the immediate obvious finding is that white people, despite being exactly the same, are perceived as more competent and more hireable than black people. And if you look at the different colors, you can see the men in blue and the women in orange. This is some of the intersectionality that NiCole was alluding to before, that you can see at the top you have the white man, the most competent and the most hireable of the two. And then in the middle, you have the white woman and the black man, kind of close to each other, but below the white man. And then below both of those, you have the black woman, who is exactly the same person as everyone else, but is perceived as the least competent and the least hireable. So we know that this is not just a matter of black people performing worse or other ethnic minorities performing worse or women performing worse. We know that there are social penalties that come along with demographics and that make life more difficult for people in academia, even if they're doing just as well. Now, this is one example But like I said, there are hundreds of CV studies, and this happens in many different ways, some of which are sneakier than others. So I'm sure we can all understand that Black men and Black women are perceived as less competent and less hireable despite doing exactly the same things. But we forget other ways that things pick up with us or things affect us. So there was a really interesting study in 2015 that looked at prospective PhD students. So if any of you in the audience hope to complete a PhD, you probably have to send some professor an email. Dear Professor so-and-so, would you consider me to be your PhD student? And many times you don't get a reply because professors are busy and we have hundreds of unread emails in our inbox. But what's interesting is who does and doesn't get the replies. And in studies like that, what we find is that if you're a woman or if you're a person of color, you're much less likely to get a reply, even for exactly the same email, which is what that study found. Other studies have found that non-white faculty members are perceived as less legitimate, less competent, less intelligent, and less personable, even when they do exactly the same things by their students. And student evaluations feed into things like promotion and progression. So even when you do exactly the same things, you are perceived as a worse professor by other members of staff, by your students. And these ratings affect how people respond to you. And then they add up together, meaning that you're less likely to get in, you're less likely to start at the PhD, you're less likely to get that first job, less likely to be promoted. And if you add all that together, I think the actual miracle is that there are any Black professors at all. I think that is the really impressive part when you consider the number of barriers that have been scientifically shown to get in the way. Not that there aren't more, but that there are any. And so we know that racism is a problem in higher education, and we have the numbers for it. And I think that question is very settled at this point. So I guess the second question, I'll hand back to NiCole for what are some of the threats to higher education right now? So now that we know it's there, what do we talk about when we think about the threats in higher education?
I can say that one, and there are many, just to be clear up front. But one of the things that my team has been looking at is something that we have called epistemic exclusion. And this is a form of scholarly devaluation. And what we find is that nobody's really paying attention to this, really. Even though when you talk to scholars, you hear this over and over and over again. It's one of these negative workplace experiences where we see consistently that those that have these experiences report that they have worse work outcomes, health outcomes, as well as psychological outcomes, and that these are differentially experienced by people of color, by women, by queer faculty. But it is a form of scholarly devaluation. You can go to the next slide for me. That we propose is rooted in some invisible biases that people have about disciplines, but also that people have about individuals, and that these become built into systems of how we are evaluating different faculty. So the theory asserts that these seemingly neutral performance standards actually are reflecting disciplinary biases about what are the characteristics of good scholarship, and also who are the people that are supposed to be producing that scholarship. And so the first bias is prejudice towards faculty of color that's rooted in negative stereotypes that we've just heard about their intelligence or their foreignness. But of course, these are not socially acceptable things to communicate and to say. And so people instead will often communicate those biases through discussions of their scholarship. And partially because very often when you bring novel faculty to the table, their research is also going to reflect novel interests, so things that are perhaps outside of the norms in that particular discipline. So the second form of bias reflects the assumption that any legitimate scholarship is going to already follow the disciplinary norms. We're going to see things like objectivity, researcher neutrality, that research will be bias-free, and that it's going to focus on dominant groups and concerns that are relevant to dominant group members, and that these are going to be the things that are seen as important and seen as relevant for a particular discipline. So notably, because of the social position that faculty have, because of them being outsiders within academia, it's going to increase the likelihood that they're going to experience marginalization and that they're going to have different lived experiences compared to dominant group members, and that this is going to then influence the things that they're interested in studying, the things that seem relevant to them. And that's going to make their scholarship fall outside of the typical disciplinary norms for any given field. Because they're outside of those disciplinary norms, they're more likely to be deemed as illegitimate scholars. But I want to point out the second form of bias is often functioning as cover for the first. So when somebody has these implicit biases that they cannot necessarily express, they may reject the non-traditional nature of their scholarship that we know that marginalized group members are more likely to engage in. So rather than saying that those faculty are not competent, they could fall back on perceived problems with certain types of scholarship, which we know is perfectly socially acceptable within academia. It's part of what we do. So this allows them to pretend that the fact that marginalized faculty member just happen to be the ones doing this research that they devalue is coincidence and has nothing to do with their identities themselves. So these disciplinary biases about the boundaries of quality scholarship, these become coupled with identity-based biases regarding marginalized individuals, and then this will thwart their ability to have objective evaluation. And given that faculty merit is determined by these systems of evaluation, these forms of bias then disproportionately will impact hiring, advancement, and the promotion of often women faculty, faculty of color, queer faculty, and these become barriers to their inclusion, barriers to equity, and barriers to their full scholarly engagement within the different fields. And so when we look at this, we see that epistemic exclusion happens through informal processes. How are they recognized? How are they seen as legitimate? But it also happens, perhaps where we have the ability to make the most change is how they happen through our formal hierarchies. So how they establish evaluation practices, how those practices then reify these disciplinary norms. They denote what scholarship is going to be valued, important, significant, and rewarded. And then those go into how we will look at who gets promoted and who gets hired and who does not. If we have time, I can come back to some of the ways that this happens, but I also want to talk about what we find in our research is that this has real consequences, and they're substantial for the individuals who are experiencing it, but they're also substantial for institutions as a whole. So epistemic exclusion leaves substantial tolls for their research, their work, their career progression. What we see is that individuals will describe consequences for their research. They may try to avoid epistemic exclusion by shifting their work or their scholarship to try to have it fit into disciplinary norms. And as many of you know, the work we do can be all-encompassing and consuming. If you're not doing work that you are committed to and that you're passionate about, it can be really difficult to persist in this line of work. And as a result, when they shift their work to try to fit those disciplinary norms, we see that they're often less productive and they're less engaged in their research. We also saw that it had consequences for promotion and tenure. When the work that they did was not perceived as being good enough, or if their research was discussed in biased ways because it was on the margins, we saw that they were unlikely to have positive promotion and tenure decisions. And participants directly tied the value of their work that they did to their pay, noting that if they're not going to be valued as scholars, they're often not going to receive those merit pay raises. And individuals also suffered psychologically as a result of epistemic exclusion. They felt unhappy. They felt dissatisfied with their jobs. They felt this lack of belonging and being isolated. They experienced their work as a place of uncertainty where they didn't have sufficient control over their life and their life outcomes regarding their work. And often described feeling crazy because they would have these messages that they experienced at work about their being devalued, but then they would go into spaces that understood their work and sometimes would be heralded for the work that they were doing. So this constant shape shifting of how they were experiencing their work being valued differing from their self-perceptions and the experience that they're having with their colleagues. And our participants also talked about the institutional consequences of epistemic exclusion, and that this was significant, where institutions lost talent and experienced high faculty turnover among these faculty, and often experienced some reputational harm, that they were becoming known as places that were not going to be supportive of faculty of color. Next slide. And our team also suggests that epistemic exclusion produces disciplinary inertia, that things continue to be done the way they've always been done, and innovation happens more slowly as a result. So those disciplines who experience a loss of research innovation, they don't ask quite as novel questions. They see new applications and adaptations. There's limited dissemination and a reduction in the proliferation and adaptation of the interventions that they are creating. This continues that disconnect that we see between the ivory tower, the populations that we educate and serve, and the public that is often funding our research. So seeing a shift in the research standards is going to require that publication venues also require inclusion, and that at a minimum, publication venues start to require that authors are reporting demographic features, that they're doing things to actually demonstrate that their work is reflecting the populations that we are serving, and that they can generalize more broadly. But I'll be talking more about what we can do for our scholarship down the road.
Thank you. I remembered to unmute myself this time. So I think epistemic exclusion is incredibly important. My work doesn't cover that. My work has covered slightly different aspects, but which are related, and I think they reflect some of the same themes. And the way I thought about discussing it was just pointing out that even within academia, we think of academia as a very left-wing space, a very safe space. So if you listen to political rhetoric on both sides of the Atlantic, actually, those of us in academia are seen as the eggheads who have gone way too far. We're all woke, and we're infecting the children with being so woke. But within academia, that's not always true. And as you mentioned, that feeling of sometimes feeling like you're going crazy because there is that sense of how much you're valued and not valued and getting different messages. And I think this is an interesting example from some of my own research of the ways in which academia can continue to promote really negative ideas. So I'm going to hope that everyone's familiar with the concept of microaggressions, small or potentially slight or ambiguous things that nonetheless communicate limitation or negativity based on demographic characteristics. And microaggressions research has really taken off since the early 2000s. So people become very interested in it. But there was also quite a strong pushback. And what was interesting about the pushback is that it appeared in really prestigious journals very, very quickly, with some very big names talking about it. Some people dismissing the entire idea of microaggressions, calling it things like macro nonsense. So not microaggressions, it's macro nonsense, saying that people shouldn't be so emotionally fragile, or that people are being a bit pathological. And describing specific explanations for microaggressions, saying that the microaggressions aren't real. What's really happening here is that all of these ethnic minorities are really oversensitive, and that's the issue. They're just hypersensitive. So it's just little things are happening to them, and they're blowing it out of proportion. And because they're so sensitive, they're making a big deal out of nothing. And these are things, you know, said by researchers like Thomas and Lilienfeld and Haidt and other people who would just say them. They would just say these things are true, and it would be taken fairly seriously. I conducted some research against this idea of hypersensitivity. And if you think about it, it should be fairly simple to do. If ethnic minorities are in fact hypersensitive, then you should simply be able to ask people the number of times certain negative things happen to them, these kind of microaggressive experiences. So being talked down to, being treated as if you're stupid, being mistaken for someone else, being mistaken for someone who serves other people, being mistaken for someone of a lower status. Like, and NiCole she's rolling her eyes because these are all the things that happen all the time. But if ethnic minorities are hypersensitive to these things, and you could just ask them how often they happen, and then how good they feel. And if ethnic minorities are hypersensitive, then there should be a stronger association for us between the number of things that happen and how badly it affects us, how negatively we feel afterwards. And that's a very straightforward study, and I did that study, and I found no evidence at all of hypersensitivity. So if you look at it, the ethnic minorities in the study are the black line, and the ethnic majorities, the white people, are the blue line. And if anything, the blue line is the one that's a bit steeper. Now that interaction was not entirely statistically significant. So I know people really care about that, and I'm going to highlight that. But if anything, if there is an effect, it's in the other direction. It's not in this direction. We're not finding the idea that ethnic minorities are over-responding to these things. They're responding about as much as anyone else. And the only reliable difference we found is that ethnic minorities experience them much more frequently. Interestingly enough, I conducted a second study that was very similar to the first, because one of the reviewers pointed out quite reasonably that there's always going to be a confound, that maybe ethnic minorities are different because they see things differently. So there might be a difference in perception rather than a difference in character, or a difference of experience. And to control for that, I repeated the study, but this time using people who were the same ethnicity, but some were majorities and some were minorities. And how do you do that? Well, you do it because you have a Korean research assistant who knows a lot of people who live in Korea, where they're ethnic majorities, and a lot of people who live in London, where they're ethnic minorities. And then you can conduct the same thing again. So everyone's Korean. It's not a matter of different perspectives or culture or expectations. Everybody's Korean. But in Korea, they were treated better. Their experiences of microaggressions were just much fewer than the experiences of microaggressions in London. So it's not a matter of people making it up or being different. This is just the effect you get. And even with the same population, even with the Koreans, the blue line is still slightly steeper than the black one. So if anything, it's the majority group members who seem to be overreacting to these experiences, not the minority group members. We just don't have evidence that ethnic minorities are being hypersensitive. I conducted a third study because it's always good to do at least one experiment. And I wish I had the budget to hire out a restaurant and be really rude to a bunch of ethnic minorities, but I did not have the budget to do that. And maybe there are serious ethical implications with doing that as well. But you can get people to reflect on experiences, and from this you can get similar emotional reactions to actually experiencing that. That's a well-established thing. It's behind a lot of other psychological research. So even if you get people to imagine doing certain sporting activities, they tend to do them a bit better afterwards. If they imagine having conversations, they tend to do them a bit more smoothly. And so you can get very similar responses if you get people to reflect on or to imagine or to remember experiences. That can get very similar. And so for this experiment, all we did was get white people and ethnic minorities to reflect on an experience when they went to a restaurant and they had a really bad microaggressive time. The waiter was a bit rude. They didn't want to take their order. They were served after everyone else. People treated them with suspicion or disrespect. And we just wanted to see how much of an impact that reflection had on people. And first of all, you'll notice that the black line is a lot lower than the blue line. So for whatever reason, ethnic minorities are just not as happy in restaurants, and that can be a whole other conversation that I could get into, but I don't really want to get into. So the overall level of happiness in restaurants is lower, but the slope of the line is not as steep. If anything, again, you see it's the blue line that's bigger in the slope than the black line. And again, not statistically significant, close in multiple studies, but not quite that coveted 0.05 p-value in the interaction. But we're definitely not seeing evidence that ethnic minorities are being oversensitive to negative stuff. If we're seeing evidence of anything, it's quite the opposite, and we're not seeing that. People respond the same way to rudeness, the same way to bad treatment, the same way to bad service, the same way to suspicion and disrespect. Whether you are white or black or Korean or anything else, this appears to be relatively stable. People tend to respond to these things in the same way. But what happens is that some people experience these things more often. And one thing I would like to point out is that what you just saw was 3 studies that took up months of my life and quite a bit of money. And when you look at this, this is the evidence that we're not being hypersensitive. And if we go back to the original papers that pushed the hypersensitive narrative and ask what was the evidence for those papers, you find precisely nothing, which is really quite impressive, that you can publish something that striking, that dismisses the experiences of entire groups of people as just being too sensitive based on no evidence at all. And the response requires evidence, saying that actually we're being quite reasonable is where the evidence comes in. And so there's a sense of a double standard in terms of how people are interpreted, even in academia. And on that note, it's important to point out ways in which, so I'm sticking with the microaggressions, but ways in which the field is regressing even. I think we take for granted the progress we make, that things are better now than they were 50 years ago and 100 years ago, and they'll be better still in 50 or 100 years. But we forget that things are better now than they were 50 years ago because a lot of people fought and suffered to make them better than they were 50 years ago. It's not an automatic process. And in some ways, even in academia, there are signs of regression, of this has gone too far and we need to push back. And the pushback against things like microaggressions, they cover some of the things that I mentioned, the kind of the hypersensitivity arguments. But there are other arguments, and I do want to highlight the work of Gordon Hodson, who's pointed out some of these in a very interesting paper that I would recommend that you read. Some of the ways in which social psychology in particular is pushing back and not accepting certain ideas about prejudice anymore. But in my own paper, I condensed these arguments somewhat differently, and I brought up things that people tend to say about microaggressions when they push back. So ideas like concept creep, and these are all quotes from people, that racism used to refer to something real, but now refers to insignificant, trivial things, so now everything's racist. Or that the liberals have taken over social psychology, so the whole program is embedded with certain political values. Or false categorization ideas, so things that aren't racist are now being reclassified as racist, which isn't very good. Or that everyone's playing the victim, so the victim mindset. So we are desperately looking for signs of racism in its apparent absence. So we're so unhappy that no one's racist anymore that we have to look for racism in all these perfectly innocent people. And ideas about the thought police, that we're creating an atmosphere in which everyone is so tense and everyone's so nervous. I mean, I assume everyone understands the George Orwell 1984 reference that you're being watched all the time, and the slightest sign of non-conformity, of being a bad thinker, now you're in trouble, and that's the atmosphere we're creating. And these are arguments made about microaggressions, but one of the things I wanted to point out was that these aren't just arguments made about microaggressions. So we can see elements of these arguments in the pushback against microaggressions. But we have seen these arguments before. They're not new. So if you go back to the 1980s, you can see that they made exactly the same arguments about symbolic racism, which maybe not everyone is familiar with, but the idea that you can do things that are racist. As NiCole was saying, if you can't just be racist against faculty, you could be racist against the way they do their research, and then it's symbolic. So it's not that you don't like Black people, you just like desegregation policies. That's really bad. You're just not a fan of affirmative action. You're not a fan of this. You're not a fan of that. And this is a way of being racist without having to say anything explicitly racist. And when the symbolic racism research program came out, people said exactly the same thing about that. The thought police, the victim mindsets, the false categorization. These are things people would say in the 80s and 90s about that. And another research program you're probably familiar with is the implicit bias research program, which seems like it's still the hot new thing, I think, in lay terms, but in social psychology, we know that the implicit association test was invented in 1998, which if you think about it, it's now old enough to drink, drive, and get married. So that was a long time ago. It's an old test. It's a very old test. But when that came out in the 90s, people would criticize it in the 90s and the early 2000s using exactly the same thing, that now everything is racist. We've extended the idea of racism to implicit things. How ridiculous. The liberals are taking over. It's the thought police again. Now we are reading changing people's minds. And they actually use the word Orwellian, which I think is great, that they really honed in on that metaphor. And so my point is that this is a conversation that we have and that we keep having. We never actually stop having the conversation. And every time we make any progress in the discussion of racism, there are elements within academia that push the progress back and that make it harder to have. And so we can't assume that we're going to keep making this progress. We always have to be aware of the people who are fighting very hard to make sure that we don't. And I'll hand back to NiCole.
And if I may just digress a bit here. One of the things I also, when I teach the Lilienfeld article, one of the things I also highlight is that this is what he chose to do on his deathbed. You know, he was actively dealing with a catastrophic illness, and his last set of writings were to try to debunk this body of research, and the power of what it means to be able to publish in a body of about a body of work that you don't focus on. It's not your program of research. It's, if you read the article, it's spewing opinion, and then it's published in a really high impact journal. It really speaks to part of where I'm going to be going here is we have a real problem in the way we allow science to move forward, and whose voices are hearable, are valued, respected, and then allowed to really do significant harm without accountability. And then who has this constant battle. You know, I imagine, would love for this not to be true, but I imagine if we look at the citations of your work debunking the article versus the original article, even if we were to correct for the number of years it's been out, it's much harder for your work to have traction than it was for his work to have traction. And I say work, his work, you know, kind of floating quotations. But I think this is a real problem that we need to have more accountability for in the field. And so in some ways, that's a piece of what this paper on the screen is talking about. We have a racism problem in the way our science is conducted, the way we are reporting our work, how we then review scholarship, as the Lilienfeld article for me is a perfect example. And then what are we doing and how we're disseminating the work? And for me, I'll be really overt. My research, my underlying premise is a social justice premise. And part of that social justice is we are publicly funding research that then does not apply to the people that have paid into those funds. So we have tax dollars that are funding a lot of our research, but then it only applies to a very tiny proportion of the population. And that to me is a significant problem. But to more specifically move back on track of what I'm supposed to be talking about, we need to make some decisions about how we're going to move forward as a science, specifically in psychology. But to be honest, I've taken this work and I've presented it at meta-science conferences to cognitive scientists, to STEM fields, and the same premises are applicable across domains. So although this paper is talking about what happens in psychology, it certainly is not unique to psychology. So we can go to the next slide, please. So I will briefly talk about a couple of the points that are made in this paper, but I hope all of you will go and look at the paper itself. But when we talk about how we're conducting research, we need to have more research, and we need to actively be teaching how to do research from a diversity science perspective. So what are the theories? What are the frameworks? What is the methodology that really allows us to do research that is embedded in these frameworks, that is accurately doing the work and doing it with integrity? So having diversity science, using research methods that are appropriate for diverse populations, that are really getting at these questions, and that actively are training our students to be able to take this work forward. Far too often, these methods and these paradigms are marginalized They are often not part of our mainstream research methodology courses, which then makes it more and more difficult for people to carry that work forward and to do it themselves. Next slide. And we also need to look at how are we reporting the research? It is shocking to me that even at this point in time, we can find studies that will talk about their samples and they will not even report ethnicity. Imagine that. They are the presumption about who is represented in that study, and they don't even think race and ethnicity needs to be reported, and that makes it through the review process all the way through to publication without anyone making the demand that they have that basic piece of information reported. That is shocking to me, and it's still happening in psychology journals. So we need to look at, are we requiring race and ethnicity to be reported? Are we requiring that key demographic variables that are related to the outcomes of the study are included in what they're reporting? And I would argue we need to also have the crosstabs reported. So we're not simply reporting gender, we're not simply reporting race, but we're also how many of that crossed information is reporting. So we know how many Black women were included in a study, how many white men are included in a particular study, so that we can make appropriate generalizations of the research. And we need to think about how is our research being reviewed. So if we look at who the reviewers are, how are they, what kind of education do they have in diversity science methods? Are they qualified to be even conducting reviews of this research? Are we seeing people that are offering their uninformed opinions on scholarship that they don't know anything about? So educating readers and reviewers on how to do this kind of review, but also if we're going to really see change, we need to make sure that we're offering and educating our authors on how do they push back when they're experiencing problems in the editorial process. So when they have comments about this work isn't generalizable, what can scholars do to push back on that? One of my big pushes is we need to be making demands that the action editors are taking action, so that when they are seeing that there is a reviewer who is bigoted in their comments, whether they are recognizing it or not, the reviewer themselves, but that the action editor is proactively providing guidance to the authors on how should they be responding to this reviewer. Should they be taking these reviews into account? And I can do deep dives into what I see wrong in the review process and how I see the bias towards reviewer opinions because the difficulty in getting reviewers and all these things. But we need to begin to more critically examine what are we allowing to happen in that review process, and how can that really be problematic for certain scholars as opposed to others? And then thinking about what are we doing to disseminate our research? Are we looking at perhaps new and creative ways, excuse me, to disseminate our work? Are we doing things that actually give our research back to the individuals that are funding that work? I'm going to pass it on to you. I get some water.
So I'll take over. I also get sometimes coughs in the middle of presentations. It's a very human thing. I never quite know what to do with it. But I'm aware that we're coming to the end and we have one last question left. So I want to answer this question very briefly, because we've talked a lot about all of this racism in academia and all the many ways in which it affects us and the threat to academia as a discipline and to our specific discipline, the kind of social psychology that we do. But why do we have to have this conversation? Why do we have to talk about all this? Why do we have to bring it up? I mean, we have the research, we have the data, we know that this is an issue. And I just want to bring up one example that might explain why this continued conversation is necessary. And this is some research that's relatively new, and it's research on what we call definitional boundaries of discrimination. And to understand definitional boundaries, we have to understand that most people accept that generally something happens and that it's not entirely fair, but they still draw a boundary around stuff that's really discrimination, stuff we have to worry about and do something about, and stuff that's not really discrimination, stuff that's, maybe it's not perfect, but we don't have to think about it. We shouldn't take it too seriously. We shouldn't get weird or pathological or a bit crazy about it. And these are what we call the definitional boundaries of discrimination. And we can make them very, very narrow. So we recognize essentially nothing except, literal genocides and very, very clear hate crimes. Or we can make it very, very broad, where we recognize even the most diffuse and the most generally kind of subtle forms of racism. And the interesting thing about definitional boundaries is that they are actually really useful tools for predicting other things. So there are beliefs like, racism has to be malicious. So if you're not being deliberately malicious, it doesn't count as racism. Or if you do it by accident, it doesn't count as racism. Or we shouldn't make accusations of racism unless we know all the facts, or unless we know that race and only race made the person do what they did and nothing else. And these beliefs sound maybe kind of reasonable on the surface, but they're excellent tools for not noticing racism. They're great tools for actually identifying stuff that isn't racism, but not very good at identifying stuff that is racism. And one of the studies that we've already done has found that definitional boundaries of discrimination are predictive of things like how you respond to all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. That when people narrow their definitional boundaries, they do in fact respond to racism differently, particularly that they respond to it less. They're just less interested in responding to racism. And so these are useful things. But the interesting part, the really interesting part, is what happens when you try to test how consistent people's definitional boundaries of discrimination are. And one example is just looking at Black versus white discrimination. So discrimination against Black people versus discrimination against white people. Now, if people are being completely honest and fair and consistent, then they should respond the same way to a question that says, well, if a white person isn't being malicious, it's not racism, and if a black person's not being malicious, it's not racism. That the questions you see on the screen are exactly the same question. And if someone is being consistent in their logic and reasoning, if this is a cognitive issue, if people are being fair, they should respond to these things the same way. But when we conduct the research, we find that they absolutely do not respond to these things the same way. Now, this is one study conducted in the US. We conducted others in the UK. We conducted one looking at sexism as well as racism. So again, to the point that this is something that's not just about race. But people absolutely do not respond to these things in the same way. That when they're talking about racism against Black people, they like to really narrow the definitional boundaries. That really, it's only the hate crimes that count when it's racism against Black people. And you have to prove they did it on purpose. You have to prove it was malicious, or else you shouldn't respond to it. When it's racism against white people, it's much broader. Then we can accept any evidence that they're not being treated fairly, any evidence that things are being discriminatory. It doesn't have to be provably malicious or on purpose. It doesn't have to be that race and only race made you do what you did. People are much open to seeing that as a form of discrimination. And this is one of the reasons why we still have to have these conversations, that even at the basic level of recognizing that something is a problem, even after we've established that discrimination occurs, even after we've established that it's not good or that it has effects, we have to have a whole other conversation reminding people that we must recognize and do something about it. And in the absence of that conversation, there is a tendency to downplay or diminish or undermine the entire conversation, to dismiss it all as madness or as hypersensitivity or as something else, when it is none of those things. And we have to be aware of this because it's a pattern of unfair recognition. So I'm aware of the time, so we're going to sum it up in terms of these three questions, which I hope we've answered, although that's a summary of it. So is there still a problem with racism in higher education? That's a very big yes. It is in caps on purpose because we know that. We have the numbers for that. And then what are some of the threats? We have things like epistemic exclusion and regression and downplaying or excusing racism. And if we have to remind ourselves of why this conversation is necessary, a huge part of that is that nothing is given. We cannot assume that simply having the data is enough, that we have to continue to have these conversations, continue to have these arguments, because there are other people who are very willing to argue in the other direction. And if we do not argue back, then that's when we face the real regression of our discipline. And with that, I'm going to call it a day because I know that we want to open up to questions. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, NiCole. I know I get to be the first person to thank NiCole as her co-presenter. I really appreciate and enjoy presenting with you. And that was really fun. So thanks very much.
I feel the same. Thank you. It's a wonderful experience. Love it.
And I want to thank you both. What comes to mind is that we probably don't need more data, but we do need more leadership. One of the questions I would like to ask you first is, how do you go about holding, say, senior managers accountable without facing conversational silence, without facing real consequences of being seen as aggressive, inappropriate, offensive? Thank you. Love to hear your reflections on that. Thank you both.
Oh, great. I'll go first then. So I want to hear what you're saying, that we maybe don't need more data, that we need more leadership. I hear in it some echoes of, I think, Tony, last name is suddenly, she said the point of racism is to always get you working to prove one more thing. So they'll say that you had no scholarship, they'll say you had no literature, they'll say you had no architecture, and you'll run off and you'll do all this research and prove them wrong, but then they'll just come back and say something tomorrow. The point of racism is to waste your time. There's always one more thing. And I do hear what you're saying. However, I do think that the data has been useful sometimes, that there is an easy way of dismissing people when they say you are treating us unfairly, and they say, don't be ridiculous. Of course we're not. But actually a CV study is quite clear to show, no, we know that you're treating us unfairly because we can see it. We can see it in the patterns of the data. Or when they say, oh, your epistemology is weak. Well, no, actually, we can see that all the evidence is this side and not that side. So I think it helps somewhat. But I think when it comes to your question of how do we then make a real difference, how do we address leadership, how do we hold management to account, I think that's a very uncomfortable question that social psychology has been avoiding for some time. I think a lot of research, like contact research, is really great, and I've done a lot of it myself, and it's about improving attitudes and making people get along. And I think what we forget is a lot of the Frederick Douglass of dealing with racism, that eventually it's going to be a fight, that sooner or later the getting along only gets you so far. And if you want to be treated better, you have to acquire power and you have to weaponize it. And it doesn't mean we have to punch management in the face. It means we could form a union or a coalition. It means we could make our demands known. It means we could outline the things that are going wrong and take people to court if we have to take them to court, or do whatever else it is. But I think we have to remember that we can't just look at this long enough and expect to convince people eternally. Sooner or later, it's going to be a fight, and we have to be prepared for that. But I don't know, maybe NiCole has a very different perspective on it.
I don't think I do, actually. My analogy is often, Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King was palatable to people because they were terrified of Malcolm X often. And so I don't know that I could say I have anything like Malcolm X tendencies, but I think, unfortunately, the desire to not get people upset, or the idea that we could do things right enough that we're not then targeted or labeled or stereotyped, seen as aggressive, or that we won't face consequences for speaking up. Unfortunately, I am known for figuring out ways of saying the hard things in ways that should be palatable. And yet I will often find that there's at least someone in the room who will say, I was overly harsh, I was, condescending, I was any of these things. And if you could have an objective person in the room to evaluate it, you know, I imagine most of those times I was not those things, but I was perceived that way because I made people uncomfortable because I was speaking truth. And the reality is, if you're going to be committed to truth, there are going to be people who will find you aggressive, uncomfortable, disdainful, any of these things. And we will experience the consequences, whether it's something, you know, is minor as social exclusion, or something as significant as being actively kind of ousted. We're going to have those experiences. So I don't know that there is a way to be honest about what's happening and to protect yourself at the same time, protect yourself from those kind of negative outcomes. Because, you know, one of the things, I'm also a clinical psychologist. I don't know if we said that or not, but one of the things I teach my clients is you do the right thing regardless of the outcome. You can't look at the outcome and then go back and say, well, did I do the right thing? Because you did what you did. If you're in right action, you're doing the right thing with the information you have. And once you put it out into the world, it's dependent on how others are going to take it in. And now we get all of their junk mixed in, and so their response can't be whether or not you did the right thing. So a long answer, I think, same outcome. If you're going to fight oppression, often you'll be targeted, and that's just kind of the reality of it.
Thank you. I could listen to both of you all evening, so please do give us lengthy, insightful answers. Very welcome. Just to indicate around time, so we're good for about 20 minutes, half an hour. If people are having questions, please post them and make them as concise as possible, because that way I can process them and forward them. I'm particularly mindful of the next generation of marginalized individuals who would like to become academics, who would like to venture out in academia, and obviously the lack of models, role models in terms of frequency, and then of course the high demands around the few role models that are available. There's a question around how do we equip students and the next generation entering higher education? Not only entering, but also to challenge racism in academia.
I think that's such a big question, although it's a very difficult question for me, because I do think that we have to ask ourselves first, before we ask ourselves, how do we equip students to join higher education? I think we should ask ourselves if we should equip the students to join higher education. I think that's a good first question. And every institution is different, and every political wave is different. But I think in the UK, we've recently seen a number of strikes, and most of the UK higher education system has been on strike consistently for 10 years. And we have been on strike about everything: treatment, pay, pensions, and I'm still here and you're still here. So clearly there are good reasons to be here. But when my sons ask me what they should do, I do not tell them that they should become a professor. That isn't what I say anymore. I say maybe do something else where you won't have to be on strike for 10 years. And so I do think that it's good that we're role models. I do think that at this point, no student who's ever interacted with me would be confused about becoming the first Black professor, and you know that's just not going to be an issue. That's already been done in many ways, and we can blaze a trail. But I think my caution is really about balancing that thing, that yes, it's always good, the representation is good, the progress is good, the higher levels of achievement are good, but I think we should also be mindful of, are we directing people to the spaces in which they will be best served? And sometimes that isn't a matter of the job, sometimes it's a matter of the country. So maybe move to Canada and do exactly the same job, but in Canada. Maybe do exactly that job, but in a different university. Maybe do this, but in a different way. But I think I have to keep myself mindful of that responsibility to say, am I encouraging the students to do something that would be best for them, given their intelligence, their talents, their earning potential? And I don't always tell them they should be academics anymore. I have to be completely honest about that. But maybe NiCole, you have a different perspective on it.
Oh, I wish I did. I really wish I did. I was one of my first thoughts when you asked the question, and I wrote about I have an article on researching while Black and female, and I wrote about this experience of having these brilliant students who, often our students are privy to more of our mistreatment than we are, because they will hear the things that get said about us, and they have the knowledge of us to assess the truth of those statements or not. And I had brilliant students that told me, we see how you're treated, we see what happens, and we don't want any part of academia. And I think that is a tragedy. And I also am seeing where the work experience in academia has shifted dramatically and continues to shift. And in the United States context right now has been really a horrific shift, and limits to academic freedom. Like, a lot of the things that we went into this job for are eroding. And I feel like we are in very much a crisis in higher ed. And I give my students a very real perspective. I also let them know that there are places that may be better and different. And how do you look for that? Because I was not aware of what to look for when I went out into the world as a baby academic. But it is not the same place. And there are ways in which it's gotten better because there are more people that have been really vocal, and we have more theories to explain some of the things that are happening. And by publishing, we give people things that they can point to as they're having these experiences. So things have improved in some ways, but I don't know that they have improved enough that I would want my children to go off into the world and follow my career path, which, often that's what we want. We want to replicate ourselves, but I feel like in replicating, I'd be asking people to go into harm often. And so I don't make that request of them. I don't do that. I will also say I've become increasingly concerned with the way racism shapeshifts, and what are we actually teaching young people? So if we are teaching them that we're in a post-racial world, what do they do and how do they understand their experiences? And I am seeing, for example, in college students, when I'm teaching these topics, where even those that have been subject to this marginalization don't always have a language for it. They haven't been reared in it sometimes. And so when they have these experiences, it's very much internalized as their deficiency. Something about them makes people not like them, and so I think we need to be very intentional in teaching young people about these various isms and how they may impact them. And there's lots of research to suggest that when they have that instruction, they are better able to go out into the world. In fact, Keon, when you were talking about that people of color, those that are subjected to these experiences, often were not having this hypersensitivity response. They even seem to show some resilience. I think part of that is the knowledge and experience of this does bring some resilience. And when you have not had that within your upbringing, you often do have a fragility to the experience that can be really harmful for you. So how does it then translate? What are we seeing in our young scholars when they go into the world without perhaps knowledge of these things and how they're happening? And they don't perhaps have some of that rich experience that, being older, I had far more discussions of racism as a real explicit form of racism, and was able to use that to translate into now this well, up until the last, 5 years or so, was a very muted, less obvious form of racism. And so without that, I think it can be really dangerous for us to send people into this profession if they don't have that rearing.
Thank you. So just to lighten up things as well, I just want to prepare you that I will probably conclude towards the end by giving you each the opportunity to ask a question of each other. So you can think about that, and I'll give you some thinking time. But before that, I just also want to humanize this space, right? You know, both of you are wonderfully, amazingly successful, belonging to what the 0.00 something percentage of marginalized individuals who have full professorship. But I bet there's a story behind that success. And I'd love to hear your trajectory, because, you know, when students see me, and by the way, I can have sometimes probably the most intimate, meaningful conversation only with my students, and they're precious. So I want to call out to our students, please stay with us. We need you. We need you as much as we can maybe help you out as well. So I'm just going to also share a little bit. So my trajectory, I'm standing here, born in Afghanistan, war-torn, losing loved ones, being labeled as an illegal immigrant child at age 10 in Germany, fighting racism, not knowing German as a language, swimming through that sea, and somehow I made it to here. And it was hard work. And increasingly, I'm questioning my investment in that hard work, in that trajectory, because there's a bit of emptiness. I mean, I keep asking myself, so is this what I've been working so hard towards? Where even at this level, in these contexts, racism, inequalities, exclusion is thriving. So I just want to give you an opportunity, if you want to just share some of your own personal experiences. You are professors, but I'm sure there's a big story behind each of you.
Well, so I'm going to say thank you for sharing your experiences first, because I think often people look and they think, oh, well, there is success. So clearly you've had an easy life. You've had all these privileges. It must be how you made it to where you are. So they don't know about the difficulty, about the migration, about the struggling through language and discrimination and all of that. And I couldn't give my whole story. It'd be too long, but sometimes I do seriously think about compiling a CV of just the rejections, and I think handing it out to students, I think that might be helpful, because I think sometimes people look at me and think, oh, well, no, he's had it very easy. He's got all these things. But if I list all the jobs I applied for, all the grants I applied for, all the papers I submitted, and all the times that they were rejected, it would be much longer than my CV of successes. In fact, so when I graduated from Oxford, and I applied for so many positions that I did not get in the final year of my doctorate, that I was very, very close to just giving up and becoming a stripper instead of going into academia, because I thought, I'm clearly never going to get this. I'm never going to get any of these posts. So if I apply to one more and don't get it, there'll be a radical career trajectory while I'm still young enough and pretty enough to make this work. So don't think that we all have it that easy. And I would say one thing I would recommend that people understand is that it doesn't go away as you go up. In fact, if anything, it intensifies. And that's not just personal experience, that's also the research, that it is the higher up you go, the more you're penalized for being an ethnic minority or a racial minority, not the less you're penalized. And the more the double standards come out, the more the higher levels of scrutiny and discrimination come out. You do get some advantages. So I'm not going to say that I'd switch back to being a postdoc now, absolutely not. That would be incredibly hard. And I hate professors who say that, because they forget how difficult being a postdoc is, the insecurity, the low pay, all of that stuff. It is much nicer when you're at the top of the pile, and I will not deny that in any way. But you can't expect that it goes away. So you have to be willing to do that fight all the way through, to understand the rejection all the way through, and the difficulty and the double standards all the way through. That never stops. And if you are prepared to keep going, then you can make it. Of course you can, because you're every bit as good as anyone else. In fact, you're probably much better than the people who are beside you. You just haven't been treated the same way. And eventually you can make that show, but don't expect the fight to stop happening. But NiCole.
Thank you both. I think the stories here, and I know a little bit more about some of the stories, and they've been harrowing. And again, the researching while Black and Female paper, I lay out a huge piece of the trajectory, at least through like around 2014. And what I can say is I went into academia kind of cocky. Like if I were to go back and look at my past self, I was like, you were quite full of yourself. You just really like, I was like, I can't stop winning, like all these job offers, and the fall from that was hard. You know, when I then started as a faculty member and just was really struggling, had years and years of really struggling. And part of the struggle was I was completely ill prepared for the kind of racism I was experiencing and didn't have language because people seemed so nice and they were smiling. And so I couldn't wrap my head around what I was experiencing. But when I did, it was actually quite freeing. And that was one of my first steps of like saying, oh, I see what's happening. I'm seeing behind the masks that people really are not anywhere near as friendly and kind as they're making themselves appear to be. And one of the other big things was finding the right collaborators. Isis Settles and I at the time were in the same department, and I was being advised, don't work with Isis Settles because she'll pull you down. And she was being told, don't work with NiCole, she'll pull you down. And they were keeping us isolated from one another. We were the only two Black women. We were the only two Black women doing work like we were doing. And yet we were told, kind of don't collaborate. And when I started to see behind the mask, my first thing was to question all the advice I had been given. And we started collaborating, and we've been collaborating ever since. And she is an amazing person to work with, and our careers have skyrocketed from our collaboration. And so, yeah, very grateful for that. But the story has been one of real hardship, real pain, real suffering. And yeah, I'm glad to say, I think I've probably getting back some of my cockiness that I came with, but it's been also part of the shift in the field, and that there's been some additional space for people to hear the work that we do and to be interested in that. And there's shifts in now there being grant money and all these things that really have been barriers to the career. So I don't know that I don't know if I'd still be here had that shift not happened, because I was really, I can't think of the word, but I was not interested in continuing the hardship in the way that it had been. And some of that also with the shift in the career has been me having the privilege to opt out of things that no longer served me. You know, my training was as a clinical community psychologist. I was in the clinical group in my institution, and just realized like they were unwilling to make the kinds of changes. I had been working and struggling with them for 20 years and realized I didn't have to continue doing that. There was no reason. I was not serving my students, my ancestors, my 7 generations by staying in the fight with those 12 people. And that instead, take myself out and try to do the work nationally that will then force them to make changes eventually that I can't make them change. And so, some of that has been because of a shift in the stage of my career and the prominence I've been able to have, but realizing there was no benefit to me staying in that fight, and I had no obligation to stay in that fight. And I guess that would be one of the things I'd really encourage young folks out there to recognize. You are not obligated to stay in that fight to your own demise, and look for other ways to create impact and change. And sometimes that means, the people that you're directly working with, you're not going to be able to change. Look for how you can make that change in other spaces, where you can find fulfillment in other spaces.
Thank you. There are a couple of more questions, and I'm also aware of time. I would like to end this session by hearing your reflection on how do we preserve the impact of these conversations. when we click out, when we log out, or when we leave physically the rooms from our offices, from the meetings, how do we go around, preserve the impact of these conversations? So that would be my last question. I'd love to hear that and maybe conclude with that. I did promise you to get a chance to ask a question of each. Before that, I would feel a very bad chair not asking or giving space to this question that a person who's female and a leader is asking around microaggression, possibly also implicit bias, and how do we go around addressing them without judgment and opening spaces and conversations. I have my own views and answers, but yours more important tonight. So I would love to hear that. Thank you. Keon, you're on mute.
Sorry. Oh yeah, so I did it again. I'll happily start on that one. So how do we address them without judgment? Again, first, I'm not entirely sure we should do that. I think that is an interesting. I think it's an interesting question. How do we address them? I think it's a good question, but I think there's a lot of really great research by like Ivy Onyador, who was at Yale for a while, and she showed that actually part of the problem with the implicit bias and microaggression narrative, as it's been somewhat hijacked by diversity and inclusion consultants of late, is that it presents it with too little judgment, and that when we express all bias in terms of things being implicit or being unconscious, it has the unfortunate ironic effect of making people less concerned about the bias and less willing to do anything about it. So I do understand the desire not to alienate people, but I think a little judgment is probably fine if people are going to be racist. I don't think you have to get rid of all the judgment. I think it's okay to have some of it in there. I think maybe for me the question would be, how do we address it in ways that are most effective? And I would say that on an interpersonal one-to-one level, I do think maybe that's where the less judgment can come in, because it's not particularly helpful. I mean, while it certainly is probably true sometimes to dismiss an entire person as a completely useless racist and sexist, this doesn't get you anywhere in real life. In real life, we have to address specific behaviors and want specific outcomes. That, you know, when it comes back to what exactly you're fighting for, and the best fights have a specific outcome. We would like to be able to vote. We refuse to be forced to sit in the back of buses. We refuse to put up with pubs that have signs that say no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. We just want to go to any pub we want. And having a specific goal in mind when you fight is usually better than having a diverse range of, we just want people to be not racist. That doesn't, I don't think that does as much. So I would say when it comes to addressing, if you have something specific in your mind, the more specific, the better, around which you can rally and use your power and get other people on board, I'd say that would be the way forward for me. But NiCole, maybe you have a different perspective on it.
Well, I don't think I have a different perspective. We've been pretty aligned so far. But when I think about some of the strategies, when I think about the way organizations run, leadership always sets the tone. And so we need to think about who are we promoting to leadership roles and what are their values here. And if this is if equity, inclusion, if creating a space where all scholars can thrive, if these really are values, then we need to see that we are selecting leadership that are going to promote those kind of values, and that are going to not just do so as like a feel-good, touchy-feely thing, but they're going to look at the structural problems that are creating barriers to these. And so what we see is there are some really obvious factors that are getting in the way. You know, how are we evaluating scholarship? How are we creating access to promotion throughout higher ed? You know, these are actionable steps that we can take, that we can embed throughout our systems and then throughout our institutions, so that we're not dependent on this one good person to have the right, you know, policies in place, or their heart is in the right place to create change. I don't want things to be dependent on the individual. I want our structures and our systems to reflect these values and to put processes in place that will promote these and not be able to dismantle them. And right now, what I see is far too often it's dependent on you happen to have a chair who cares about creating equity. We happen to have a dean that wants to make sure faculty are happy in their jobs. And so that dean or that chair happens to do things that create a better environment. And then they move to another position or they step down, and now the next chair dismantles everything that they've done. Or they simply don't care, so nothing progresses. And if we want to have change, we have to have leadership that values these changes, and we have to create changes within the structures, policies, and institutions that are not dependent on having the right person in that role to create change.
Thank you. Quickly, do you have a question for each other?
So I've been thinking about that in the background, and I have a lot of questions for NiCole on her specific research, but I think more generally, a few years ago, I hounded you a bit about a potential collaboration. And I think if I had one question for you, it would be to reopen this conversation, because I have wanted to collaborate with you for many years, and I know we haven't quite managed to make it work. I know things get busy, but if you're in any way less busy, I think my question for you, because I find that I have so much to learn from you, is if you'd be open to a collaboration with me again in the future. I think that would be, I realize this might not be very enticing for the audience as they watch me make an academic proposal, but if you are interested, I think that would be, for me, the ideal outcome, if you'd say, yeah, I'd be open to collaboration. Although I realize now I put you on the spot, which is awkward. It's like those awful people who propose marathons, that, oh, it's so awkward. So I probably shouldn't have done that, but now it's out in the open, so I guess it's on you to happen.
Well, this is where I say yes, absolutely. No, absolutely. In fact, as I listen to you present your research, I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is incredibly exciting, incredibly important. And not only would I be very enthusiastically open, but also really open to thinking about how do we tweak the dissemination piece so that it's getting out to these broader audiences, because the work that you're doing is really critical to some of the national discussion here in the US, and I imagine also in the UK, and needing to speak these. And I know you have your amazing book Skewed, which is doing some of this, and you have another book that's about to come out, but I would love to see more conversation on how do we get this narrative and get this information into the public discourse so that it's creating some of the, well, contributing to the possibility of creating more substantive change in how our society is functioning broadly.
Great. Do you have a question, NiCole, for Keon?
Maybe I'll make that my question. Do you have ideas for how you might move some of this dissemination to these public audiences?
So I do have some, so thank you for that. And thank you also for plugging both of my books. I really appreciate that. And I'd also say that you have a particular gift for taking academic research and showing us not only why it's interesting and novel, but why it's important. So you're very, very good at that. And I do think that part of it is, if we're serious about that, we have to make it our jobs to be good at it. I think in academia, there is sometimes the false impression that being totally incomprehensible is a sign of intelligence, and we fall for this all the time. We go to a talk by some very important professor and we have no idea what they're saying, and this is taken as a sign that that person is so much smarter than us that we cannot follow them. But that is not true. You can explain anything. You can explain genetic drift. You can explain gravity-focused time dilation. You can explain anything in 5 minutes if you're determined to explain it well. And I think you're really good at that. I think you have either a natural talent or you've worked on it very, very hard. Maybe both, I don't know. But I do think that as academics, if we're going to do that, we can no longer be content with getting something published in the highest impact factor journal if literally no one else can understand it. We should write from the bottom up in such a way that other people can understand. It's not discrediting our intelligence, it's just making us better communicators.
Well, Thank you, and I look forward to reading and engaging your collaborative outputs. I want to come to a close, and I want to offer my sincere thanks to our speakers, Professor NiCole Buchanan, Professor Keon West. Thank you also to those who have helped with the smooth running of the event. Professor Tim Lustig, Director of ILS, Dan, Matt in our AVS team, and Steve Kilney in ILS. And of course, to you, the audience, for your support and contribution to the Global Challenge lectures. And as always, some great questions. I've tried my best. Sometimes I was distracted by the insightful answers, so do forgive me if I didn't manage to read out or process your questions. I want to also make some announcements, which is, as hopefully you'll be seeing by now on the screen, ILS has 4 more lectures currently scheduled for spring 2024. The next Global Challenge lecture will be presented by Dr. Tristram Hunt, Director of the Victoria and Albert Museum and former Member of the Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central and Shadow Secretary of State of Education. It is another hybrid event taking place on Wednesday, the 7th February at 6 p.m. in the Westminster Theatre and also available online. You can find more details and please do register on the ILS website. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming and have a peaceful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.